Abtahi. I'm President and the Board of Director of Andishgah, in charge of the economics. And I got my glasses. And today's discussion is the part of the lecture series that Andishgah started last October, where we began to provide background knowledge in different aspects of running Bank Markazi and monetary policy. So we started that in October, and in that specific session we talked about the notion of governance, corporate governance, or usul hakimiyati in Bank Markazi. So under the auspices of the governance, risk management, and compliance, we have already talked about this governance. Today is going to be a discussion on the risk management, and then hopefully at some point in the future about compliance. In terms of the content, as E.T. mentioned, it is the application of risk management to Bank Markazi. So we start the presentation with a summary and recommendation for Bank Markazi, and from then on we move to the topic of what is risk. After all, that's the best way to start the discussion. And from then on, I will quickly go to what is called the soul of an organization, which is the risk culture. And within that, then we touch upon risk management. And after that, we'll talk about some of the components of financial risk, which are market risk, credit risk, operational risk, and systemic risk. And last, we'll finish it with actually a more detailed discussion of systemic risk, because that is the risk that Iran is facing in a big way, effectively. So it is very customary these days to compare Iran and Turkey, whatever the subject is, specifically if it is economics. That is their GNP, this is our GNP, this is their GNP capita, and this is our GNP capita. So I thought the best thing to do is also in the area of risk management in general, compare the two. And one of the best places you can do that is you go to the research departments and their website to see what it is that they published recently. Well, the story about Bank Markazi, unfortunately, is very sad, because when you go through it, although they have some classification of articles in terms of periodical and occasional paper, practically, that whole research department has been frozen since 2004. Effectively, which is not a surprise, because under Mr. Ahmadinejad, everything got frozen, so this is not an exception. And then you move to the Central Bank of Turkey. It's a different world by any stretch of imagination, full of articles, interviews, research, CDs, and also organized by subjects, by year, and also the depth of these articles is highly advanced. And also the diversity of the article also is very broad. So here we are. We have the country, Central Bank of Turkey, with full of articles. They understand risk management, and they know, they have effectively all the background that is necessary for this topic, and others as well. And you compare that to Bank Markazi, which basically doesn't have anything, unfortunately. So I want to get started with the recommendation. Now, just to give you the size of this whole thing about central banks and sovereign wealth funds, these are the two that are mentioned at the same time. Basically, the total assets of central banks and sovereign wealth funds globally is about $15–16 trillion. It's huge. Number two, practically, I would say up to 90% and 80%, and I'm sure Dr. Mehran will know that number better than I do, are managed by professional managers, if you like. And within that professional manager, one of the most important tools that they use is risk management, and hence the topic of our discussion. The next attribute, characteristics of this industry, if you look at it, there's been tremendous development and advancement in the last couple of decades. And especially in the last 10 years when Bank Markazi was frozen, the rest of the world was effectively improving at a dizzying speed, effectively. And also another thing that has happened in the industry, there is a lot of collaboration between the banking industry and the central bank in the area of risk management and financial modeling, something obviously that is not happening in Iran. And then the next item that is important in this industry is their reputation. So they do everything obviously to prevent any reputational damage. And there's a good reason for that, because if your reputation is damaged as a central bank, you basically lose your credibility. And credibility is the most important element of any central bank, because if you don't have it, two things will happen to you. Number one, you cannot have any effective monetary policy because you don't have any credibility. Nobody is going to listen to you, number one. Number two, as an institution, you will not be left alone as an independent entity because you have a lot of reputational problems. So credibility and reputational damage is very important for the central banks of the world. And the last attribute of this industry, these guys are a bunch of conservative institutions. What that means, they basically invest in AAA rated instrument, effectively. So this is, to summarize, it's a huge industry. It's run by professional managers. Risk management is one of their most important tools. And there are a bunch of conservative people who care about their reputation a lot. Let's move along and see what's happening with Bank Markazi. Bank Markazi basically doesn't have any risk management, nothing of the sort that we're going to be talking about, number one. Number two, in terms of their credit exposure, if you recall, I just mentioned that the banks, the central banks are very conservative and they have AAA rated holdings. In Bank Markazi's holding is all of these loans that have been extended to domestic institutions. And God knows what their credit ratings are. If you want my gut feeling, it's pretty bad, effectively. Most of them are effectively under some sort of bankruptcy, as far as I'm concerned. So they don't even, so Bank Markazi does not even follow the notion of conservatism that exists with other central banks. And the reason why, by the way, that Bank Markazi ended up with this portfolio of these loans because of the irrational and populist policies of Mr. Ahmadinejad, that basically printed the money in order to give the money to people because he couldn't basically fund it in any other way. Now, in terms of the lack of leadership, you see, the leadership, especially the central banks in general, they go a long way to convince you that they have great risk management system, they have great operational manual, and so forth and so on. They disclose that publicly. They don't hide it, because by disclosing a risk management system, you're giving comfort to the market that we know what we're doing. Well, you look at Bank Markazi, it's just the opposite. We have no idea if they have any risk management system. I bet you they don't. I mean, it just doesn't look like it. Number two, what is important is that Bank Markazi has qualified staff. Bank Markazi has always had qualified staff. The problem is the leadership of these banks. There hasn't been a single leadership that I can tell you of that in the last 10, 15 years that should have or could have taken the initiative to set up a risk department. So if there is a problem within Bank Markazi that cannot effectively have a risk management, it is not the staff, it's the leadership that needs to be addressed. Moving along in terms of their foreign exchange reserve management, again, you look at the website, you have no idea what their philosophy of managing foreign exchange is. Well, here's the issue. They act as a fiduciary. It is our money, Iranian people, that we've given them to invest for the time being. And they don't tell you how they're doing with your money. It's the same thing if, let's say, if you have an account with Fidelity in your mutual fund, you want to go and find out how the return on your stock and portfolio is, they say, well, we can't tell you. Well, it just doesn't happen in the rest of the world. So there is no disclosing of any type of philosophy of how these guys are managing our money effectively. Number two, they need to prepare for systemic risk. Iran's economy is greatly susceptible, as I will explain and I will elaborate on that, to some sort of a systemic risk, where normally a seemingly small event can lead into something huge and a big consequences. And the last recommendation that I will make is that Banque Markazi needs to start a collaboration with the banking system and the academic world. And there's a reason for that, is that specifically in the area of risk management, in the rest of the world, there's a lot of collaboration between the academic world, Banque Markazis, or their central banks, and the banking, because the knowledge is basically percolating along these, and they need to be an exchange of that. So as we get closer to that part, I have suggested a joint venture to be formed, call it the Institute for Risk Management, that their role is going to be to educate anything that has to do with risk management for the economy, for the manufacturing businesses, for financial services, for non-financial services. So that institute, we will talk about it when I get towards the end. So in summary, if I would basically tell Mr. Rouhani that he should consider the development of risk management for Banque Markazi and the financial institutions in Iran as their top priority. Because if you don't have, the only alternative to risk management is crisis management. And in the crisis management, if it happens, it's much costlier, huge damages, and it will happen at the time when Iran's economy is going through such a hard time. So that is the summary of the recommendation. Let's get into the topic of our discussion. One disclaimer I have to make, sorry. You will see that the implementation of any of my recommendations here for Banque Markazi needs to take into account the applicable laws and regulations in Iran, effectively, number one. Number two, it's more even important to say that how these laws get interpreted in Iran has a bearing on whether my recommendation is feasible or not. Therefore, throughout this presentation may appear to be focusing on the ideal recommendation, which some of them may not be readily, if you like, applicable in Iran. I am aware of that issue, but you need to start with the ideal in order to implement something. So what is risk, basically? Because we're talking about the risk management, let's talk about the risk component before we get into the risk management. Risk, basically, I would say the colloquial definition of risk is when something bad can happen to me. That's risky. Well, let me give you a couple of examples of what other definition of riskiness or risky is. If I come and tell you what is the probability of an earthquake in California a week from today, you pick up a number, you say 1 in 100,000. So fine. In that respect, that's a pretty low risk, effectively, because of low probability. But if I change my question and I said that, well, what is the probability of the earthquake within a month, I said, and at the same time, if it happens, the damages will run into the billions and trillions. Is that a risky issue or not? Now that I gave you the event, and now that I gave you the impact, you said, no, this is risky. Oh, there's a reason for that, because initially you used the definition of effectively only probability. But now I added the impact of the riskiness, and that changes a lot. It's the same thing. Let me give you another example. If there is a frozen lake out there, and nobody is crossing on that lake, is that a risky lake? No, actually. Let me tell you why. This is, by the way, a philosophical question as well, because back in the 1650s, the famous Irish philosopher George Berkeley asked the following question. And the question was, if a tree might fall in the forest, but there is nobody to be hit, is it risky? No. Because nobody is there, effectively. So, we will use the definition of risk by combining both impact and likelihood. I'm not just going to look at the likelihood or probability, I will also consider the impact. That is the definition of the risk that I would like to use, which is, by the way, 90% of industry is using the same thing. So with that definition, let's talk about talking about risk. So it is probably very easy if I tell you that risk is omnipresent. It's everywhere. Let's say from the minute you get up in the morning, you take a shower, there's risk for you to fall. You get on the highway, there's risk to have an accident. You go up the elevator, there's risk to be involved there. If you're a businessman, there's risk everywhere. So risk is part of our life, effectively. But these risks, they have some characteristics. Some of them are basically, may not be completely voluntary. It's imposed upon you. Other risks are basically you seek them out. I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, you want to take a risk, effectively. Some risks are highly complicated, and some are fairly simple. And others could be substantial consequences, but some of them could be insignificant. So risk will come in different form, shape, size, and complexity. Now, what is also true that if you look at in the human advancement, that every major advance in human civilization, from the caveman invention of the tool, to today's invention that with the gene therapy, from the caveman tool to today's gene therapy, has been made possible because someone was willing to take the risk and question the status quo. So risk is absolutely essential for our survival. And I want to start with, to give you a 2.5 million year history of risk in 3 minutes. The famous French philosopher, I think, said that I think, therefore I am. I would have liked to add another sentence to him if I was alive at that time, or he was alive here, to answer him, well, I risk, therefore I survive. So I'm ahead of you, Mr. Descartes, because if I don't survive, you're not there to think. So we start basically with that definition. Now, risk and reward, was, for much of the human history, was basically we, a human, faced with physical risk and material reward, effectively. By that, what I mean, the prehistoric human, they lived a short and brutal lives. And effectively, the risk-taking caveman ended up living, and the conservative cave person who stayed in the cave died. But the caveman that was risk-taker, he took physical risk and had material reward. That was the notion of risk and return for probably more than 2.45 million years, until humanity discovered two other things. When humanity discovered the notion of transaction, and also they began to understand to lay out infrastructure, then they began to deal and have commerce. What that means, a merchant would hire a bunch of salesmen, get them across the ocean, they go there, they buy and sell something, they come back hopefully with a return. What that tells you now, for the first time, after 2.5 million years, there is a separation between physical risk and then the financial return. The merchant didn't take any physical risk. It was a sailor. He got the reward. So for human beings, basically, we attributed for many millions of years anything to do with flood, storm, success in battle, to either fate or the divine will, effectively. If God wants to do something, there's nothing we can do, so we might as well be passive. That was the mentality of humanity for millions of years. Until before, and so all the way moved from 2.5 million years to come to about 16th century. Until that, by the way, the only risk management system that I can think of that existed was collateral. People used collateral for a long time, but beyond that, it was all to do with divine and praying and this and that. But things changed in the 16th century because of two things. Number one, development of probability and statistical theory took off in 1650s or thereabouts. Because of that, we were able to now begin to quantify and assess some of these risks. Number two, humanity has, by that time, had been keeping records data and history, and they notice that there are patterns that occur over time. So they got the notion that maybe history can be, after all, forecasted. So good database management, if you like, and some advancement in the periodical, in probability theory, and this is happening at the same time where the civilization entered into era of Renaissance, and after that the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, the Germans, the French, and basically the age of reason finally arrived, and with that, basically rationality and experimentation became the engine of truth and knowledge. So, so from then on now, we began to understand the risk and then also be able to measure it. Once you understand them, hopefully you can measure it as well. And therefore, as a species, we don't need to be any more passive in this world, effectively. The future can be made predictable with probabilistic calculation. It is not only what God wants, occasionally, I guess. It is, we can make certain measurement to control, have control over our own destiny. Once we basically began to understand that we can make some probabilistic statement and control on our lives, another thing happened in civilization, and that was intentional risk-taking was born, and it became the main drivers of underlying scientific and economic advancement. Once people could understand risk, then intentionally they wanted to take risk, and they had tools to measure it, and that helped humanity in advancing as we went through the centuries. Now, move a few hundred years or a few thousand years, I lost track of where I am on the history of 2.5 million. We're now in 1960s, basically. Most of the initial advancement in risk management occurred in the insurance business. But there's an issue with that because in the insurance business, they always deal with the negative aspects of risk. I.e., you buy the house because you're hoping that your house is not burned. You buy insurance on your life. It's always negative, negative, negative. Whereas in reality, threats and opportunities, most of the time they come together. It's not all negative, effectively. It's not even all positive. They come together. And one has to effectively be able to model both sides of the equation. And that's when the risk management for other industries, including financial institutions, took off. Three also incidents that happened in the last 30, 40 years worldwide is important one for getting perspective on risk management. Number one, in 1988, Basel I, which is basically a capital adequacy directive by Bank for International Settlement, for the first time, they calculate the riskiness of an institution, if you like, and they told them how much capital they need to carry. So that put a big push on the banking side. In terms of the corporations, there is a report by the name of Turnbull Report in 1999 in the UK. It was the first time that the corporate governance actually was mentioned explicitly. And then in this country, after the fiasco of the WorldCom and all the other problem we had in the 2000-2001, we came up with the famous Sarbanes and Oxley rules that is applicable to us here. Now, so, the importance of risks, I think it's obvious by now, but in order to understand it, we need to ask some very basic questions about risk, i.e., what constitutes risk? Can we manage it? Can we make money off it? Can we identify and measure it? Can we totally eliminate it? How do we classify it? Is the taxonomy important, the way I do it versus the other person? How does a risk propagate in a network? When something occurs as a trigger mechanism, how it propagates throughout the economy. And what is the difference between risk and uncertainty? That's a very important one. Because humans are intolerant of chaos, and we have a strong affinity for finding and inventing order. That's the way we have been built over millions of years. Therefore, the human condition abhors, hates, abhors uncertainty. It abhors uncertainty, but not risk. There is a difference between risk and uncertainty. And the difference is as follows. In the risk, basically, you know both the probability and also you know the outcome. For example, if I throw up a coin and I ask you for head and tail, you say it's 50% probability, and you also know the outcome is either head or tail. In that type of scenarios, markets can price risk when you know the probability and when you know the outcome. In the uncertain world, you don't have that. You don't have actually any historical background to make any prediction based on that. And sometimes these calculations are basically indefinite or not even incalculable. And that is why market cannot price uncertainty. To get a sense of uncertainty, let me give you another example. If you play Russian roulette, if somebody comes with a Russian roulette and tell you, I'm not going to tell you how many bullets I have in this gun. Is this a risky situation or uncertain? It is uncertain. Because if it was risky, you would have said, I have a Russian roulette and there's one bullet in it. If that's the case, you know the probability is 1/6, and you know the outcome would be either you're dead or alive. So the outcome is known, probability is known, it's risky. Now when I come and tell you that, I'm not going to tell you how many bullets, that becomes all of a sudden uncertain. And I would make it even worse. I would be a bad guy. I'm going to tell you, not only I'm going to tell you how many bullets I'm going to give you, I'm not going to tell you even whether the gun is fake or for real. Now that really ambiguous. That is what I call uncertainty. So there is a famous joke about an economist that he had lost his key and he was looking for it under a lamp post where there was light. Well, somebody came and said, well, why are you looking here? He said, well, because there's light here. That has a great connotation in the world of finance. What this guy is saying, I'm only concentrating on a problem that I can quantify. And I'm effectively ignoring important problems that is out there. So if, as they say, you swim in the known water as opposed to the unknown water. Some of you may be familiar with the famous Donald Rumsfeld's famous interviews, unknown knowns, known unknowns, and all that combination. He was talking about uncertainty and risk. But just to get a sense of this, what I'm talking about is that, number one, I want to make some observation here. Measurement and quantification can occasionally anesthetize your judgment. It will give you a sense of, basically, sometimes a false sense of comfort. So quantification can be bad at times, effectively, because it truly maps, it covers your view. And that's why, by the way, a lot of people who are analytically inclined, they don't like to go to the judgmental sphere. But most of the time, the risks are in the judgmental sphere, not in the analytical sense. And actually, if you read the history of the 2008 crisis, with the events leading the 2008 crisis, one of the main reasons was exactly what I just told you. That people, regulators, banks, everybody assumed and concentrated on things that they could precisely measure it and quantify it. So they only dealt with the so-called, what they thought is risk, where the problem was in the uncertain, or it was in the unknown water. So you have to be careful with this quantification. Moving along on this, sorry, before I forget, also you have to be careful that you cannot just say, I don't want to do any quantified analysis. No, there's room for both of them, as a matter of fact. But because on the other side, you just don't want to go and make decisions based on guts or my feelings and this and that. It doesn't work that way. There is a balance between intuition and quantitative analysis. Intuition comes with experience sometimes, and that's why a lot of young people in Wall Street brought the disaster we had in 2008, because they were smart, quantitative, but no experience or intuition. The first place to talk about risk management is risk culture as well. Because risk culture, to me, is the soul of an organization. And to compare it with a society, you see, if you look at a society, society is comprised of three spheres: economic capital, human capital, and then social capital. These are the most three important ones. And by the way, I would say out of the three, economic and social and human, social capital is the most important capital. This is not a place to discuss about it, but Iran right now, social capital is zero, negative, it's frozen in that sense. But putting that aside, in a typical society, if you like, if you have the right culture, you will impact your social capital, and if you have social capital, you will have a prosperous society. The same thing analogically can be said about the banks, as central banks or any institution. If you have a proper risk culture, you will then have a proper enterprise risk management. And if you have an enterprise risk management that is robust, then the organization can basically survive and prosper. So in this case, the commitment, the discipline, consistency, and behavior of senior management of Bank Markazi is so essential in establishing a strong risk culture. This is not, forgive my English, this is not BS, believe me. The risk culture and issues like that, it really starts at the very top level, consistency at the top level, credibility at the top level, that they value these things that we call our culture. So a lot has to be focused on that particular topic itself. In terms of the risk culture, one of the things that you need are the personnel that are competent and committed, that are competent and collaborative and communicative. By that I mean the personnel should be the guys that are good, they're team players, and they discuss ideas. When you do that, then the dynamic of the organization is moving along. And talking about the risk culture within an organization, it's actually simple. Basically, there are four subsections. Number one is to have the commonality of values and ethics and purpose. Number two is universal adoption and application, which meant that the rules and regulation you write is applicable to the governor of central bank all the way to the employees, and they practice it all the time. And three, to have a strong risk culture, you need to have a free, transparent, and honest communication. If you have that, and somebody wants to defraud or risk start somewhere, that employee then has the courage to discuss that issue with his boss, so to prevent some of the fraud that can happen. So free, transparent, and honest communication is important. And last, obviously, every individual at that institution has both the responsibility at their own level and also at the group level. So the question for us is that does Bank Markazi acknowledge the importance of risk culture, or does it have the risk culture or not? Obviously the answer to that is no, but let's move on. Here's how to initiate a strong risk culture at Bank Markazi. Number one, this is the step-by-step, I would say, by the leadership of the Bank Markazi. So let me go here. That's the first five, I think, recommendation that I'm giving you here. Number one, they should first assess the reason for not having an acceptable risk culture. Now, I know, you know why there is no risk culture in today's Iran, politically and so forth. So, but they need to do more than that. They look at it very professionally to find out what it is that makes Bank Markazi tick, and what can we do about it. The second one, they should appreciate that inculcating a new culture takes at least 3 years. Organizational theorists can tell you if you want to change the culture of an organization, it is at least 2 and maximum probably 5 years. So it's not an easy thing that you can do it overnight. Because it's 3 years, you need consistency. You can't just give it up. The senior management has to lead by example, as I said, throughout. Number four, they should acknowledge constructive and continuous dialogue. And the last, they need to effectively produce a comprehensive code of conduct which is of international standard. I don't want a manual written by an HR guy that, you know, is from the 1320s when the British were there and they gave us the code of conduct. It has to look at the international standardization of some of these code of conduct and implement it in Iran. And then the next thing is that Bank Markazi, like any other organization, should not take the recruitment policy and training lightly. Because, after all, we all agree that the businesses prosper or go down by the quality of the people. Well, to ensure you have a quality of people, you have to make sure at the hiring you have the right people, and also you have a continuous training throughout the organization. As a matter of fact, if I had it my way, I would make the employees of Bank Markazi or any institution that has anything to do with the risk management, they would have to take a workshop and a refresher course every year, and they need to pass it with an exam to make sure that they know what they're doing effectively. Now we talked about risk and risk, so let's talk about risk management. Well, we take risk effectively every day, as I said. As a matter of fact, anytime you get into any discussion where you begin to talk about the pros and cons of that decision, you're taking risk, basically, every time you do that. So the question is that if I'm taking risk all the time, well, why can't I just basically organize it in a systematic way as a risk management? Not as an individual, also as well as a corporation. And this need, by the way, it is by far gets the attention, is that when you consider that in today's world, which is changing at a dizzying speed, we have a world that's changing so fast that one cannot sometimes imagine. It is highly, highly interconnected. It is unpredictable, has a lot of the feedback system going on. It is much, much bigger, more volatile, more complex. In that world, as understanding the risk and having risk management is basically the essence of survivability. There's no other way an organization can survive in this complicated world if it doesn't have some resemblance of risk management for their operation. So, as I said earlier on, the only alternative to risk management is obviously crisis management. And crisis management is much, much more expensive than this. The importance of risk management are a lot. Number one, it actually focuses the management attention on data. They get a feel for the risk data. Second, they prevent, most of the time, fraud. Let me tell you something about fraud. There's no system in this world that can guarantee you that there will not be fraud in your organization. No matter how well you do it, if few people can get together from different departments, they can cheat you. The only hope you have is to have a system that will catch them sooner than later. So let's have some sort of an expectation, managing expectation about risk management. So the benefit is reducing risk. It provides an integrated response to multiple risks. It forces you to have an intelligent and informed decision making. It makes your organization resilient, proactive, and it also allows you to analyze, allocate capital rationally. There's a system that is called RAROC. That means you compare a different project in terms of their riskiness on the return that they get. So the benefits are huge. People, when they begin to read about risk management, they give up. They say it's so difficult. There are so many diagrams. I can't make sense of one from the other. Well, I understand that risk itself is highly complicated. It's multifaceted and interlinked. So risk can be complicated. But the risk management actually follows at the end a very simple two steps, which basically asks the following question: what could happen and what should do we about it? That is basically risk management at the essence of it. So if you're a chairman of the company, you don't need to have a fairly sophisticated question. Let's ask a simple question: what could happen and what should we do about it effectively? That is the risk management. Now I can take these two dichotomy type analysis to a little bit more and I will leave it at that because otherwise the diagrams would be a lot. There's a cycle to risk management process. It starts at the point of the risk identification. Number one, you have to identify the risk. You know, where are they? What are they? Number two, once you identify, you need to quantify them. Hopefully you have by now all the measuring technique to quantify it. And once you quantify it, you need to find out what is the prioritization of these risks. And from then on, you need to do what's called a risk mitigation. Risk mitigation means once you understand the risk quantified, well, what do you want to do with it? You want to eliminate it? You want to share it? You want to reduce it? You want to retain it? That is called risk mitigation. And then after that is the risk monitoring. And this cycle is happening not in a vacuum. As I said, it's happening within a culture that communicates, collaborates, commit, and then they comply effectively. That is a risk management system. It doesn't matter whether you are a GM or Citibank or a small corporation. This is basically what risk management is. So, I've already mentioned that here, eventually. Let's move to the next one. Talking about, as I said, I've been talking about the intuition and the quantification. Here's about judgment, experience, and quantitative technique. Risk management, as I said on the first line, is as much about basically managing people, process, data, as it is about quantitative analysis. So it's both. Basically deals with human being and data as well. Many financial crises, basically like Baring Brothers or Baring Company that went bankrupt in 1995 because of effectively one single trader had big losses that the management didn't ask for the report or didn't see it. The reason why I'm saying it is that when you have an inadequate operational control, two things will happen to your organization. Number one, your employees may take more risk than is necessary. Number two, this process of taking more risk takes longer before you catch it. That's what happens when you have a simple risk oversight. One of the things that I was surprised by the famous fraud, I think 2002, Bank Million, Bank Saadrat, to the tune of $3 billion, it apparently was going on for 3-4 years. That shows you that there is not an iota of risk management in here. So inadequate operational control, even of simple nature, basically will have those two consequences. And one of the criticisms that you hear, especially in the last few years, about the risk management is that they say it is too much dependency on and focus on measuring technique at the expense of sorry, did you say can you hear? Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me now? All right, thank you. I thought you wanted to date it. So anyway, what I'm right here, measuring risk basically entails both in the experience and intuition, both at the same time. And so we don't need to go to either extreme, effectively. A precondition for Bank Markazi's management is that, number one, if they are supposed to get to anywhere that I'm recommending, number one, they should understand and actively manage Bank Markazi's risks in the sense that the executive board, the Hayat Ahmed of Bank Markazi, should have a fairly good grasp of risk management. Number one. Number two, they must appreciate the risks that are taken at Bank Markazi at a different level and exactly the trade-off between risk and return. And these people, the Hayat Ahmed, have to have ultimate responsibility for the risk, credit, market, operational liquidity, and strategic.
Your microphone is off. I think your power is in the
Still we can hear.
I hope you've been listening to me the last half hour. All right. All right. Okay, we'll go first page. All right. Anyway, so basically trying to say that if the executive board of Bank Markazi doesn't have any knowledge of risk management, so you might as well forget about advising to them because they don't have the precondition. But having said that, what I suggested is that maybe Bank Markazi should start with what I call a diagnostic review. Assemble a committee of 7 people, let's say, comprised of the executive board, let's say 5 of them, and also 2 or 3 professionals from outside that they understand risk management. They are in charge of the diagnostic analysis of risk management. Basically, their role is going to ask some very, very basic questions that I'm going to talk about right now. Here are some of the questions that they need to ask. Number 1, in terms of the risk culture and governance, is there proper risk management or oversight at any level of the bank? I think the answer is no, but you need to ask that question to make sure as part of this committee. All right, we're getting there. Number 1. Number 2, how often do the management of Bank Markazi get together to discuss risk management? What kind of decision do they make effectively? Number 3, in terms of the capacity and risk appetite, you need to ask what is today's appetite, the amount of risk that these guys are taking. Are they playing with effectively with the risk management, with the foreign exchange that we have no idea what they're doing? So they need to ask all these questions. Are these at acceptable level or not? Do they have any operational risk management control? Number 4 is the risk measurement and transparency. Are there right skills, tools, and processes in place at Bank Markazi in order to measure, assess, and manage the risk? Do we have that, or we only have just a bunch of smart people there and nothing else, effectively? Is there any limits of any time that Bank Markazi has in terms of tolerance, limits, overall, anything that basically can stop effectively a fraud? They need to ask that question. And then a couple of others, and the last one is that I said they need to immediately identify 3 to 5 risk events that can have major impact on Bank Markazi. They should do that as soon as possible. And one other thing they need to do immediately is that they have to have at least 3 committees. And these are Market Risk Committee, Operational Risk Committee, Credit Risk Committee. These have to be there as soon as possible, because if you don't have these 3 committees, you're not running a central bank effectively. So, moving on. Now, the first one, the financial risk. I mentioned that we're going to be talking about broadly about financial risk. Financial risk, in general, are part of the overall risk that is, that has credit risk, market risk, operational risk, systemic risk. We are not going to talk about the credit risk and market risk. They are for 2 reasons. One, it's mathematical, but more importantly, operational risk and systemic risk of Bank Markazi is by far more important than the market and the credit risk. So that's why we picked those first, and hopefully we'll do the others later on. We will not also talk about Bank Markazi's gold position because of the limitation of time. So here we are. Number 1, in terms of operational risk. Operational risk is basically very simple. The finance industry, historically, especially in the mid-80s, really developed and focused on market and credit risk. Because operational risk was, well, who cares? Is the procedure? Is this and that? So people basically went to the easy part first. And for, I would say, until 1995, they didn't do much think about it. And then all of a sudden, from basically starting in the late 90s, people began to talk about operational risk and how much damage lack of an operational risk can do. And finally, in 2005, when the BIS Basel Accord came out with the Basel II, it for the first time told the banks to methodically calculate the capital that they need for operational risks. Prior to that, they were telling them, put aside capital for market or credit. Now they're telling the banks, you need to put additional capital for operational risk. And then since 2008 crisis, if you look at all the crises and most of the problems and fiascos, part of it because of lack of the operational risk management there. There are many definitions of operational risk. I will just give you one here. And basically it says the risk of loss resulting from inadequate or failed internal process, people, and system from external or internal. What that means is that the risk can come from internal events, and that could come from people, technology, process, or it comes from the external event that you don't have control at least. And to give you some example of these two, internal and internal events could be the incomplete data, fraud, thefts, crime, policy and risk analysis failure, personnel failure, and so forth and so on. On the external, risk would be a system attack, hacking, when people hack into your computer, telecom and internet failure, pandemic, terrorism, natural disasters, all of that could impact your operation. And some of you who are involved with the, let's say, the merchant, with the tsunami case in Japan, have impacted the supply chain of many, many industries globally that particular risk brought to that into the whole global industry. Now, the primary goal of an operational risk should be simple, basically. I should ask the following question. Is it easy for people to do the right thing in my organization? And is it hard to do the wrong things? That's a simple question, but captures the essence of what the operational risk can do. I.e., do I have an organization where honest people can survive and prosper, and bad people can be caught? If your answer is yes, that means you have an operational risk management, effectively. Let's move on a little bit further down because I want to talk about systemic risk. But what you need effectively in operational risk, a combination of comprehensive ethical code of international standard, and if you have a strong risk culture, then you definitely will have an effective operational risk management. And that is effectively what is needed for any operational risk management. And banking markets should do the same thing. Now, this is the last section of my presentation, and I'm going to spend time on this a little bit more. It's about systemic risk. As you may recall, we said financial risk has 4 components. We have credit risk, market risk. We will talk about these 2 in other sessions in future. We just talked about briefly about operational risk. Now we're going to talk about systemic, not systematic, systemic risk. And also in terms of Banque Markazi, ranking of the risk that they're facing, systemic risk is the highest. After that is operational risk, and then credit risk, and then market risk. This is the order of importance for Banque Markazi, as I understand it from their site. There is no universal definition of systemic risk, but I'll give you an example of these systemic risks so you understand what they are effectively. Number 1 is the famous Great Depression of the 1930s was considered a systemic risk. Later on, the developing countries default on their bond, the LDC, the less developed countries, Latin Americans' debt was a major problem and brought a systemic crisis in the 70s and 80s. The famous U.S. saving and loan, some of you who were old enough, back in the 80s, maybe yes, the 80s, the cost was anywhere between $300 to $500 billion, and it had a major impact. Then you had the Japanese, God save them, I don't know how they're doing it. They've been in this problem since 1987 up to now, effectively, in terms of systemic risk. Then we had 2 crises that were related somewhat. The Asian financial crisis, 1997, and the Russian default on their bond effectively was considered a crisis, and also it impacted some other hedge funds because there was a famous hedge fund by the name of Long-Term Capital Management that owned a lot of bonds in this area, and they went belly up, and it was a major cost to the banks and the liquidity. And then obviously the last one that I can mention to you, obviously, is the crisis of 2008, is risk, systemic risk. Now, a lot of people, when you talk to them about systemic risk, the first thing they tell you, well, what is bank run? Bank run is part and parcel of most of the systemic risk. Basically, it happens when a single bank, effectively, the depositors lose their interest and they begin to withdraw their money. And then the neighbor starts talking to each other, and the other guy says, well, maybe my bank has the same problem, but just to make sure, I'm going to go withdraw my deposit. And that sequence of event all of a sudden feeds on itself in a cascading fashion, and lo and behold, within a few weeks or a week, the whole banking sector goes illiquid. And some of these banks are pretty healthy, but they were caught because of this fear of bankruptcy. And I have suggested, by the way, here that Bank Markazi really needs to study the banking crisis of some of these countries that I mentioned here. A wealth of knowledge exists here in how you deal with it. Because if you tell me that Bank Markazi does not have in the right-hand corner, I don't know if you know the desk better than I do, the right-hand corner of the desk of the governor, a copy of simulation for systemic risk prevention, you might as well, kick them out effectively. You have to have those plans ready, and to do that, you study all the other systemic risk that has happened, and you get some sense of what is, some of these principles are universal. Now, Bank Markazi, okay, one of the things I would love to do to Bank Markazi, sorry, there's a lot of people from Bank Markazi here, is that on their name card, when you're sitting on a desk, you have your name card in there. I would love to write on it the following, that risk does not take holidays, it only hides. It only hides. So every time they come to their desk, they should remember that the risk is always there, effectively. Number one. Number two, Bank Markazi needs a panoramic view of the financial services. Panoramic view, I don't mean physically with the pictures standing on top of Bank Markazi or something, but basically has to have enough data across the banks that he can consolidate and begin to understand a sense of what is out there within the banking industry. That's what I mean by panoramic view. And because Bank Markazi is the only organization that is well placed to, number one, to recognize these risks, two, to prioritize them within a framework that maps potential consequences, and three, to trace the chain of cause and effect throughout the system. Bank Markazi has that ability, and they should better do it and have all the data to back it up. To move on, some of the other recommendation and questions for Bank Markazi. There are three important questions that the bank can ask. Number one is that how soon the bank can detect an emerging risk before it becomes systemic. It's so important. How soon can you say that this thing is dangerous, I better do something about it, number one. Number two, what are the things that the manifestation of emerging systemic risk? What are the initial signs of systemic risk that if I see them, that's, oh, okay, this is systemic risk brewing, if you like. And then the third question is that what part of the system, the structure of banking would magnify systemic risk? What are the issues that, if it exists in a banking system, would magnify the problems that you have? So, Bank Markazi should obviously know when the risk becomes important. They should also understand what are the manifestations of some of these risks, and then magnification. And to answer those three questions, you need basically to respond to those three boxes that I have right here at the top. On manifestation of systemic risk, here are some of the signs that if you see it, I think you have a pretty good chance of coming up with a systemic risk. Number one, events that happen suddenly and are also unanticipated, number one. Events that have huge and widespread impact on the economy. Number three, when the market, especially credit, becomes illiquid, to the point sometimes that banks will stop lending each other overnight. This is what happened in 2008. Basically, over a weekend, the system actually in the US almost collapsed. I don't know if any of you are aware of the severity of that, but basically Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, over a weekend, all of them basically said, if we don't do anything on Monday, we're broken because of the illiquidity. Number four, the prices decline substantially across the board before something that can happen in systemic risk. And then number five, you get some effect on the real economy. So the problem is not only on the financial institution, you begin to sense that the market is entering recession. That is why I don't call 1987 the collapse of stock market a systemic risk, because it happened on I guess Friday, and Monday follow up. By Wednesday, Thursday, the market was back up and running, and the economy actually did not even slow down. So that is not a systemic risk. So those are the manifestations. Where do these risks can come from? Basically, they can come from everywhere. They can come from the economic sphere, geopolitics, environmental, social, and healthcare, like pandemic. Unfortunate thing about Iran is that Iran is vulnerable in all of these five fields. I can give you example in every single one of them that can lead to systemic risk. Normally, in a normal country, you only have one segment that could cause you systemic risk. As usual, we're number one in basically having ability to systemic risk to be triggered in any part of our activities. That is an achievement. Magnification of systemic risk, these are the few things that basically can make a systemic risk worse. Number one, if you have connectivity. The more connected you are, the more the propagation gets to you and the more you may collapse. Some people, by the way, believe that that's not true. As a matter of connectivity increases stability. I don't want to get into that debate, but for the time being, accept my argument that if you have more connection, problem will get to you faster. Number two is complexity. If you don't know these instruments that are out there or the transactions that are out there, you have no idea, then everybody jacks up the premium on whatever they're trying to sell. This happened again in 2008. People began to say, what is the CMO, CDO, CDS, all of these Greek alphabets that the banks have come up with their products. It was too complex to understand, and that magnified the problem that we had in 2008. Leverage is another factor. Leverage is bad everywhere, obviously. There is an optimal level of concept of leverage. But the more leverage you have in the system, the less equity you have to absorb shock. So it would make you more fragile. And then last is opacity, which is basically if you don't have any transparency, people don't know what is going on behind the scenes, so everybody wants to sell and run away. So we have issues that can tell us the manifestation of the systemic risk. We know where they're coming from. We know what magnifies them. And to give you a sense of that in the economy, this, you know what? This diagram reminds me of something. It reminds me of human brain, and I read somewhere that the day a neurologist could understand every connection in your brain, that is the day you will know God. That is the day you will understand this universe. I would like to be inspired by that statement and say that the day in economy you can understand the relationship, that all of those relationships between zillions of people in the economy, you have full control on the economy. As a matter of fact, you've done away, you have eliminated uncertainty. Everything is certain. But that's not the topic here. What I wanted to say that economy is a compilation of agents interacting all the time with feedback mechanism in a network, so that a typical, let's say, a systemic risk could start with a small event in one of these spheres and effectively propagates very quickly everywhere. And when that happens, interconnection, credit risk, market risk, and liquidity risk all will feed from one to the other in a very unpredictable, nonlinear fashion. Iran's financial system is very prone to systemic risk. I mentioned briefly that Iran is exposed to all of those subcategories: economic, financial, social, environmental, and geopolitics. I'm just giving you one example on the financial side. Iran's financial sphere is lack of transparency. Nobody knows what the hell is going on in Iran's financial services. Do you have direct and exact information on Albanese or Qard al-Hassanis? And even Bank Markazi, you don't get the right data about their management of foreign exchange. So definitely there's transparency problem over there. Two, there's concentration in real estate. Everybody is exposed, from individuals and the banks to real estate. The same thing happened in 2008 here. U.S. was highly people involved, exposed to the real estate, and a small subprime problem in real estate got magnified, as we all know. Number three, there's huge credit exposure in the banking system to a few select people. These are the cronies and the rentier that during Ahmadinejad they got all the loans effectively. So the banks have huge credit exposure to a select group of people. And it shows, by the way, on the delinquency. If you look at the delinquency of Bank Markazi, is actually today is about 22% of the loans are delinquent, compared to an average of 5% in the emerging markets, effectively. So here, just on some of the manifestation of the systemic risk. That's why I'm telling you that this is fairly fragile in that sense. So now, how to prepare Bank Markazi for detecting risk? Number one, Bank Markazi should know and ask, how can we construct a system that prevents financial problem from one single small institution to plunge the whole economy down to a level that is depression? So that is the question number one the governor of Bank Markazi should ask that. When you ask that, immediately you say, okay, I know the risk. And I said, well, what is the risk? They know the probability and the events. I know, identify these risks, I know what they are, and I have some measurement of the probability. But that's not enough. That's a fairly static data you have. You need to ask the question about the timing of all of these. For instance, how fast could these risks arise? Now that you've identified in that symbol, how fast could they come up? Is it a year, a month, 6 months? So how fast could they arise? And how would they propagate? In what channel would the risk can go to the other part of the economy? How fast could the Bank Markazi respond or recover to a situation like that? And how much downtime can Bank Markazi afford to have and tolerate? And finally, when should an extra liquidity be injected to Iran's economy? So those are the additional questions that they need to ask. And that, by that I mean, by the way, if we look at, as I said, about the panoramic view of the financial system, Bank Markazi should have, as I said, the panoramic view of the financial services in Iran to identify the system-wide problems. Now, to emphasize again what I said earlier on, we need to ask again, Bank Markazi is the only place, the only regulatory body that it can recognize the risk, it can prioritize it, it can trace the risk. And they should use that panoramic view as part of the tool. Bank Markazi potentially has 5 tools for preventive remedies for systemic risk. They normally, by the way, central banks have some sort of a depositor protection. In this country, we have FDIC. Number 2, Bank Markazi should implement demand, request, and whatever force they can use to implement a risk governance system in the financial industry. We have been talking about risk management for Bank Markazi. There's a whole host of other things related to the financial risk for commercial banks, something that we will deal with later.
So they need to impose that risk management on the banks as well. Bank Markazi has a panoramic view. They should have it because of data. They are the lender of the last resort. They have to make sure they have enough liquidity, and the speed of intervention has to be pretty quick in order to be effective. And if you do that, then the last question is that, well, how soon the bank can detect an emerging risk before it actually becomes systemic risk? The answer to that is you need to understand what we call system structure, which is a term I use from the engineering world, which is basically it integrates various aspects of the risk construct, because risk coming in many, many ways. You need to relate them to understand it, not just to cut them in silos. And when you do that, by that I mean here, basically these are all the questions of the risk that you need to not only ask them in separation, that you need to ask them as a group, their interaction in an economy, number one. And when you do that, you have to understand there are four forces occurring on our economy: financial forces, economic forces, social forces, and political forces. Once you do that, you begin to understand that, then you are beginning to understand what we call the system structure, which is at the deepest level of understanding any system. So modeling risk separately is suboptimal, and at times can lead to obviously wrong recommendation. That is why I'm recommending in a more integrated fashion. And here's what happens if you do it, by the way, on a silo basis, on a separate basis. This is a very simple argument. If you do the separate modeling of risk, basically you lose information because you're not taking into account the relationship between risk. So you lose information. Now, what is knowledge? Knowledge is basically processing information. So you have less information, you will then have model knowledge that is effectively processing the information is fairly incorrect. And lack of information basically leads to incomplete knowledge. And when you have an incomplete knowledge, it leads to a partial understanding of the system. And when you have a partial understanding of the system, well, that leads to the totally incomplete understanding of system structure. That's why you need to look at it as an integrated basis. So understanding, let me emphasize here, system structure also, by the way, requires multidisciplinary approach. The reason why I'm bringing that up towards the end is as follows. But before I get to that multidisciplinary approach, look at where we are right now. Number one, Iran is facing a potential systemic risk. Number two, these risks can arise from any of those spheres: economic, financial, social, environmental, or politics. Next, Bank Markazi is not equipped, and I emphasize not equipped, to deal with systemic risk, unfortunately. Number four, they should obviously, as soon as possible, implement these preventive remedies for systemic risk. And hopefully, if they get to a point that they understand the system structure by integrating various risk transfers, then they can claim that they have an agile and responsive institution that can collaborate in a multidisciplinary approach. And what I mean by the collaboration and multidisciplinary approach, if you recall, I said in the last 2 decades there has been tremendous efforts in the relationship between the academic world, commercial banking, private world, and Bank Markazi or the regulatory bodies. A lot of information that goes back and forth. I am suggesting the same thing should happen for Iran. And before that, by multidisciplinary, I mean the following. Bank Markazi needs to build a multidisciplinary operation that brings economists, financial experts, accountants, and lawyers, among the others, together. You need to bring people from different fields, because if you do not do that, the complexity of mathematics and the mathematics and financial models basically scares people away. Effectively, only a bunch of rocket scientists sit in their room and they do the math and nothing happens. You need this multidisciplinary approach. As they say, just in war, in war, it's too important to be left to the generals. Risk management has become too important to be left to a bunch of rocket scientists, effectively. And here's my last proposal. I'm proposing a joint venture to be formed between Sharif University initially, Bank Markazi and Bank Melli to form an institute that they can call it Institute of Risk Management, IRM. That institute would provide research, analysis, modeling for all the industries, from manufacturing industry, financial institutions, non-financial, public institutions. And they can even issue certificates if people want to graduate from that. Risk understanding should be part of the culture, if you like. And therefore, if you have a robust risk management system for all the institutions in Iran, we will have a profound and positive outcome for our entire economy in the future. Thank you so much.